October 15, 1957. The rain was coming down hard on 125th Street when Vincent, the Chin, Gigante walked into Small's Paradise with murder in his eyes. He had one job that night: eliminate Ellsworth, Bumpy Johnson, the man who had become the biggest thorn in the Italian mob's side. Gigante was confident, methodical, a professional killer who had never missed his target. He waited in the shadows, watching Bumpy laugh with friends at his regular table. The shot was perfect, the distance close, the angle clean. Gigante pulled the trigger. The bullet sailed through the air, destined for Bumpy's head. But something impossible happened. Bumpy moved at the exact moment, reaching for his drink, and the bullet shattered a mirror behind him instead. What happened next changed everything anyone thought they knew about power in Harlem. Bumpy didn't run, didn't duck for cover, didn't even flinch. He stood up slowly, looked directly at Gigante's hiding spot, and smiled. Then he did something that sent chills down the spine of every witness in that room. He walked over to where Gigante was crouched, picked up the spent shell casing, and handed it back to him. "You drop this," Bumpy said calmly. "Next time, don't let Lucky Luciano's boys pick your hiding spots. I've been watching you for 20 minutes. Gigante's face went white. This wasn't luck. This wasn't coincidence. Bumpy Johnson had known about the hit, had prepared for it, and had just demonstrated a level of intelligence gathering that made the FBI look like amateurs. But here's what nobody understood then, and what historians are just beginning to piece together now. That night at Small's Paradise wasn't about surviving an assassination attempt. It was about sending a message that would echo through the underworld for decades. Bumpy Johnson didn't just control territory through violence or intimidation like other crime bosses. He had built something far more sophisticated, far more powerful, and far more terrifying to his enemies. He had created the first true criminal intelligence network in American history, a web of information so comprehensive that he knew what his enemies were planning before they did. To understand how Bumpy Johnson controlled 40 blocks of Harlem without firing a shot, you have to understand that he wasn't thinking like a gangster. He was thinking like a general. And his battlefield wasn't the streets. It was the human mind. The year was 1935 when a young Ellsworth Johnson first learned the lesson that would define his entire approach to power. He was 15 years old, standing in the Savoy Ballroom, watching Dutch Schultz's men shake down local business owners. Schultz controlled Harlem's numbers game through pure brutality. His enforcers would walk into shops, demand protection money, and beat anyone who refused. It was effective, but it was also expensive. Schultz had to maintain an army of thugs, pay bribes to dozens of corrupt cops, and constantly watch his back for rivals who might use the same violent tactics against him. Young Bumpy watched this operation with fascination, but not the kind you might expect. He wasn't admiring the power. He was analyzing the waste. Every broken window, every beaten shopkeeper, every bribed police officer represented inefficiency in Schultz's system. Violence, Bumpy realized, was the least sophisticated tool in the criminal toolkit. It was loud, messy, unpredictable, and it created enemies faster than it eliminated them. That night, Bumpy made a decision that would change everything. He wouldn't build his empire on fear. He would build it on information. The transformation didn't happen overnight. For the next 20 years, while other criminals were building reputations through shootouts and territorial wars, Bumpy Johnson was quietly constructing the most sophisticated intelligence operation in criminal history. He started small, paying attention to details that other gangsters ignored. He noticed which police officers had gambling debts, which judges had mistresses, which politicians had financial problems. He remembered the names of shopkeepers' children, the birthdays of community leaders, the personal struggles of everyone from street sweepers to city councilmen. Most importantly, he understood that information was only powerful if it was used correctly. Bumpy never used what he knew to destroy people. Instead, he used it to help them, creating a network of obligation and gratitude that was far more binding than any contract written in blood. By 1950, Bumpy's information network had grown beyond anything law enforcement could comprehend. He had sources inside police precincts, City Hall, federal agencies, and rival criminal organizations. But his most valuable assets weren't criminals or corrupt officials. They were ordinary people. The barber who overheard conversations while cutting hair, the waitress who served drinks to mob lawyers, the janitor who cleaned offices where sensitive documents were left on desks. These people didn't work for Bumpy because they were afraid of him. They worked for him because he had helped their families, protected their businesses, or solved problems that no one else could handle. When Mrs. Rodriguez's son was falsely accused of stealing from a white-owned store, Bumpy made the charges disappear. When old man Jackson couldn't pay for his wife's cancer treatment, Bumpy quietly covered the hospital bills. When the Italian mob tried to muscle in on Samuel's grocery store, Bumpy had a conversation with someone, somewhere, and the harassment stopped. No shots were fired. No threats were made. Problems simply disappeared, and people remembered who had made that happen. This network of gratitude and obligation became Bumpy's true weapon, and it was more powerful than any gun ever manufactured. When the 5 families decided to move against Bumpy in 1957, they made the fatal mistake of treating him like a traditional gangster. They assumed his power came from his ability to hurt people, so they focused on neutralizing his muscle. They bribed his enforcers, threatened his lieutenants, and planned to eliminate him through superior firepower. What they didn't understand was that Bumpy's real army was invisible. It consisted of thousands of ordinary people who owed him favors, felt grateful for his help, or simply respected what he represented in their community. When Vincent Gigante was planning his assassination attempt, he thought he was moving in secret. In reality, his every move was being reported back to Bumpy through a chain of sources that stretched from the docks where Gigante bought his gun, to the hotel where he planned the hit, to the restaurant where he discussed the operation with his associates. The bartender at Gigante's favorite speakeasy was a man whose daughter Bumpy had helped get into college. The gun dealer was someone whose brother Bumpy had protected from a rival gang. The hotel clerk had received a loan from Bumpy when his mother needed surgery. None of these people were criminals. Most of them had never met Bumpy personally. But they all understood that information flowing to him was information that helped their community stay safe and prosperous. This wasn't about fear or intimidation. It was about alignment of interests, and Bumpy had spent decades ensuring that his success was inseparable from the well-being of Harlem itself. The night of the assassination attempt at Small's Paradise demonstrated the true scope of Bumpy's power in ways that terrified his enemies far more than any display of violence could have. When Bumpy handed that shell casing back to Gigante, he wasn't just showing that he had known about the plot. He was revealing that the Italian mob's most carefully guarded secrets were completely transparent to him. Over the following weeks, as word of this incident spread through the underworld, something unprecedented happened. The 5 families began receiving information about their own operations from sources they couldn't identify. Frank Costello learned that Bumpy knew about his Swiss bank accounts. Carlo Gambino discovered that his private conversations with his underboss were being reported back to Harlem within hours. Lucky Luciano, calling from his exile in Italy, found that his phone calls were somehow being monitored by someone with resources that matched or exceeded those of federal law enforcement. But Bumpy's genius wasn't in collecting this information. It was in how he used it. Rather than blackmail his enemies or expose their secrets, he began solving their problems. When Costello was facing a federal investigation that could have sent him to prison for 20 years, evidence mysteriously disappeared from FBI files. When Gambino's son was arrested on drug charges that could have destroyed the family's reputation, the charges were quietly dropped due to procedural errors. When Luciano needed certain documents delivered to associates in New York, those documents arrived safely despite intense federal surveillance. Each time Bumpy helped his enemies, he made it clear that the assistance came from him. He wasn't demanding payment or loyalty in return. He was simply demonstrating that cooperation was more profitable than conflict. This approach was so alien to traditional mob thinking that it took months for the family bosses to understand what was happening. Bumpy wasn't trying to destroy them or take over their territories. He was offering them something no amount of violence could provide: security. The transformation in Bumpy's relationship with the Italian families didn't happen through negotiations or treaties. It happened through a gradual recognition that opposing him was not only impossible but counterproductive. By 1958, mob bosses who had spent millions trying to eliminate Bumpy Johnson were instead coming to him for advice and assistance. Not because they feared him, but because they had learned that his success made their operations more secure and profitable. This reversal of power dynamics was unlike anything in criminal history. Traditional gangsters built empires by conquering territory and eliminating rivals. Bumpy built his empire by making himself indispensable to everyone around him, including his enemies. The 40 blocks of Harlem that Bumpy controlled represented something far more sophisticated than a criminal territory. They constituted the first truly integrated criminal legitimate business ecosystem in American history. Every numbers runner who collected bets also served as an early warning system for police raids. Every legitimate business owner who paid Bumpy for protection also provided cover for his financial operations. Every community leader who accepted his help with social programs also became a source of information about city government activities. This wasn't a protection racket in the traditional sense. It was a mutually beneficial network where Bumpy's success was tied directly to the prosperity and safety of everyone within his sphere of influence. The police found this system almost impossible to penetrate because it didn't depend on criminal activity that could be easily detected or prosecuted. Most of Bumpy's power came from perfectly legal activities, helping people solve problems, providing loans and assistance to struggling families, mediating disputes that might otherwise turn violent. When federal investigators tried to build cases against him, they discovered that his most valuable assets were relationships, not criminal enterprises. His most dangerous weapons were favors owed and problems solved, not guns or intimidation. This made him virtually untouchable through traditional law enforcement methods, because prosecuting him would have meant dismantling a social support network that benefited thousands of law-abiding citizens. By 1959, Bumpy Johnson had achieved something that no other crime boss in American history had accomplished. He had created a criminal organization that actually reduced crime in its territory. Robbery rates in his 40 blocks were lower than in the rest of Manhattan. Violent crime was virtually non-existent. Drug dealing was controlled and regulated rather than chaotic and destructive. Business disputes were resolved through mediation rather than violence. Police corruption decreased because officers found it more profitable to work with Bumpy's system than to take bribes from multiple competing criminals. The federal government found itself in the bizarre position of investigating a crime boss whose activities seemed to be improving the community he controlled. This paradox became even more pronounced as Bumpy began expanding his influence beyond Harlem. Rather than moving into new territories through violence or intimidation, he began offering his services to other communities facing similar problems. When the Italian mob tried to take over numbers operations in Brooklyn, Bumpy helped local operators organize a resistance that made the invasion unprofitable. When corrupt police were shaking down businesses in the Bronx, Bumpy provided information that led to their exposure and prosecution. When politicians tried to cut funding for social programs in poor neighborhoods, Bumpy's network of contacts ensured that decision-makers understood the real-world consequences of their choices. Each successful intervention enhanced Bumpy's reputation and expanded his network of allies. By the early 1960s, he was receiving requests for assistance from community leaders, legitimate businessmen, and even law enforcement officials who recognized that his methods were more effective than official channels for solving certain types of problems. This transformation from criminal kingpin to community problem solver was unprecedented in American organized crime, and it demonstrated a level of strategic thinking that his contemporaries couldn't match or counter. The key to understanding Bumpy's success lies in recognizing that he had redefined what criminal power meant. Traditional gangsters measured their strength by their ability to hurt enemies and reward friends. Bumpy measured his strength by his ability to solve problems that others couldn't solve. Traditional crime bosses built territories by excluding competitors. Bumpy built influence by making competitors dependent on his services. Traditional criminals operated outside the law. Bumpy operated in the gray areas where law and necessity intersected, providing services that were illegal but essential to community functioning. This approach made him simultaneously the most powerful and the most legitimate crime boss in American history. His power was real and measurable, demonstrated by his ability to control territory, influence government decisions, and command respect from both criminals and citizens. But his legitimacy came from the fact that his activities generally benefited the communities where he operated. This combination of power and legitimacy made him virtually untouchable, because eliminating him would have created more problems than it solved for everyone from beat cops to federal agents to rival crime bosses. The 40 blocks of Harlem that Bumpy controlled without firing a shot represented the ultimate expression of this philosophy. They demonstrated that criminal power, properly applied, could be more effective than legal authority in addressing the real problems that affected people's daily lives. This wasn't about glorifying criminality or suggesting that illegal methods were preferable to legal ones. It was about recognizing that Bumpy Johnson had discovered something profound about human nature and social organization that transcended the traditional boundaries between legal and illegal, legitimate and criminal, community service and personal profit. When Bumpy Johnson died in 1968, the system he had built began to fragment immediately. Without his personal relationships, his network of favors, and his sophisticated understanding of how to balance competing interests, the 40 blocks of Harlem quickly reverted to the chaos and violence that had characterized them before his rise to power. This collapse demonstrated that his control had never been about institutional structures or transferable assets. It had been about his unique ability to see connections where others saw only conflicts, to find solutions where others saw only problems, and to build trust where others relied on fear. The legacy of Bumpy Johnson's approach to criminal power extends far beyond the world of organized crime. His methods were later studied and adapted by political organizers, community activists, and business leaders who recognized that lasting influence comes not from the ability to force compliance, but from the ability to align personal success with collective benefit. The 40 blocks he controlled without firing a shot became a template for understanding how real power works in complex social systems, and why the most effective leaders are often those who make themselves indispensable rather than those who make themselves feared. This philosophy of indispensable leadership found its most profound expression in Johnson's handling of what became known as the Cotton Club Crisis of 1952. The legendary nightclub, a symbol of Harlem's cultural renaissance, faced closure after a series of violent incidents threatened to bring unwanted federal attention to the neighborhood. Traditional crime bosses might have seen this as an opportunity to eliminate competition or extract protection money. Johnson saw it differently. He understood that the Cotton Club represented something far more valuable than immediate profit. It was the economic and cultural heartbeat of his territory. Rather than exploiting the crisis, Johnson orchestrated what witnesses later described as a masterpiece of diplomatic intervention. He brought together club owners, rival gangs, police officials, and community leaders in a series of carefully choreographed meetings. Each group believed they were the primary beneficiary of his attention, yet all emerged with their core interests protected. The club owners retained their independence while accepting informal oversight from Johnson's network. The police received assurances of reduced violence and increased cooperation with legitimate investigations. The rival gangs found new revenue streams that didn't threaten the club's operation. The community leaders saw their concerns about neighborhood safety addressed through increased informal security presence. The genius of this arrangement lay not in its immediate resolution of the crisis, but in how it created a new model for managing complex territorial disputes. Johnson had essentially invented what modern business theorists would later recognize as stakeholder capitalism, a system where success is measured not by the defeat of opponents, but by the creation of value for all parties involved. The Cotton Club not only survived but thrived, becoming a showcase for how criminal influence could enhance rather than exploit community assets. This approach attracted the attention of legitimate business leaders who began seeking Johnson's counsel on matters far removed from traditional criminal enterprise. Corporate executives facing union disputes, real estate developers navigating community opposition, and even government officials dealing with civil rights tensions found themselves drawn to his unconventional wisdom. Johnson's apartment became an unlikely salon where the boundaries between legal and illegal, legitimate and illegitimate, began to blur in ways that revealed the artificial nature of these distinctions. One particularly illuminating example involved a major construction project that threatened to displace hundreds of Harlem families. The developer, a wealthy white businessman with significant political connections, had initially tried to force the relocations through legal channels and political pressure. When community resistance proved stronger than anticipated, he found himself facing costly delays and negative publicity. Traditional approaches, increased legal pressure, higher financial incentives, or simply waiting out the opposition, had all failed. Through intermediaries, the developer approached Johnson for advice. What followed was a 6-month negotiation process that transformed not just the construction project, but the developer's entire approach to urban development. Johnson helped him understand that the community's resistance wasn't simply about money or even displacement. It was about dignity, continuity, and having a voice in changes that affected their lives. Instead of viewing residents as obstacles to be overcome, Johnson reframed them as partners whose local knowledge and investment in the neighborhood's success could enhance the project's value. The final agreement included provisions that went far beyond standard relocation compensation. Displaced families received first priority for employment in the construction phase and permanent jobs in the completed development. Local businesses were given preferential contracts for supplies and services. The building design incorporated community space and cultural elements that reflected Harlem's identity. Most importantly, an ongoing revenue-sharing arrangement ensured that the community would benefit from the development's long-term success. The developer later credited this experience with revolutionizing his business model. He began applying similar collaborative approaches to projects across the country, discovering that what he initially saw as Johnson's criminal cunning was actually a sophisticated understanding of how to create sustainable value in complex social environments. The Harlem Project became one of his most profitable ventures, not despite his collaborative approach, but because of it. This pattern repeated itself across numerous industries and situations. Johnson's influence extended into labor relations, where his mediation prevented strikes that could have crippled Harlem's economy. He facilitated agreements between competing businesses that created new markets rather than simply redistributing existing ones. He even played a role in early civil rights organizing, helping activists understand how to build coalitions that included unlikely allies while maintaining their core principles. What made Johnson's approach particularly effective was his deep understanding of human motivation and social dynamics. He recognized that most conflicts, whether in criminal enterprises or legitimate business, arose not from irreconcilable differences but from misunderstandings, fear, and the zero-sum thinking that assumed one party's gain required another's loss. His genius lay in identifying creative solutions that expanded the total value available, allowing all parties to achieve their essential objectives. This philosophy extended to his handling of law enforcement, where he pioneered what might be called cooperative competition. Rather than viewing police as natural enemies to be avoided or corrupted, Johnson treated them as professionals with their own objectives and constraints. He understood that police officers wanted to maintain order, advance their careers, and serve their communities, goals that weren't inherently incompatible with his own activities, properly managed. Johnson's relationship with Detective Ray Morrison exemplified this approach. Morrison, a dedicated officer with a reputation for integrity, had initially been assigned to investigate Johnson's organization with the explicit goal of building a case for federal prosecution. Instead of attempting to avoid or intimidate Morrison, Johnson engaged him in what became a complex dance of mutual respect and strategic cooperation. Morrison later described their relationship as the most professionally challenging and personally enlightening experience of his career. Johnson never asked him to ignore criminal activity or compromise his integrity. Instead, he helped Morrison understand the broader social context in which criminal activity occurred, and how selective enforcement could serve law enforcement's larger objectives while maintaining community stability. This collaboration produced remarkable results. Crime rates in Johnson's territory dropped significantly, not because criminal activity ceased, but because Johnson's network provided early warning systems for serious crimes and helped resolve disputes before they escalated to violence. Morrison's arrest record improved dramatically, as Johnson occasionally provided information about criminal activities by organizations that threatened community safety or operated outside accepted boundaries. The arrangement required delicate calibration from both parties. Morrison maintained his reputation for honest law enforcement, while achieving better results than his peers. Johnson continued his illegal activities while reducing the risks and negative consequences for his community. Both men understood that their cooperation depended on never explicitly acknowledging what was happening, maintaining the fiction of adversarial roles while working toward compatible objectives. This model of cooperative enforcement spread throughout Harlem's law enforcement community, creating an unprecedented period of stability and prosperity. The neighborhood experienced its lowest crime rates in decades, while Johnson's organization operated with minimal interference from federal authorities who found little evidence of the violence and disruption that typically justified major interventions in organized crime operations. The sophistication of Johnson's approach became most apparent in his handling of succession planning. Unlike traditional crime bosses who relied on family loyalty or brutal suppression of potential rivals, Johnson began developing a distributed leadership model that could survive his eventual removal from the scene. He identified and mentored dozens of younger operators, teaching them not just the technical aspects of illegal enterprise, but the social and psychological principles that made sustainable criminal leadership possible. These protégés were encouraged to develop their own territories and specializations, creating a network of allied but independent operations rather than a traditional hierarchical organization. Johnson's role evolved from direct operational control to strategic consultation and conflict resolution. This distributed model proved remarkably resilient when federal pressure eventually forced his retreat from active leadership, as the network continued functioning effectively without requiring a single dominant successor. The lessons from Johnson's approach to criminal leadership resonated far beyond Harlem's boundaries and well beyond the world of organized crime. His methods were studied by political scientists interested in community organizing, business theorists exploring stakeholder capitalism, and sociologists examining the relationship between formal and informal power structures. The 40 blocks he controlled without violence became a case study in how sustainable influence operates in complex social systems. What made Johnson's model particularly fascinating to researchers was how it anticipated many principles that would later emerge in modern organizational theory and network governance. His understanding that sustainable power required buy-in rather than compliance prefigured concepts like distributed leadership and stakeholder engagement that wouldn't become mainstream business practices until decades later. The way he structured information flow through his network, ensuring that intelligence moved efficiently while maintaining operational security, demonstrated an intuitive grasp of what systems theorists would later formalize as network resilience and redundancy principles. Perhaps most remarkably, Johnson's approach to conflict resolution within his network became a template for what negotiation experts now recognize as interest-based bargaining. Rather than simply mediating disputes between his associates, he would work to identify the underlying needs and concerns driving conflicts, then engineer solutions that address those root causes while advancing the network's overall objectives. This approach not only prevented the destructive internal wars that plagued other criminal organizations but actually strengthened relationships within his network, as participants felt heard and valued rather than simply controlled. The economic impact of Johnson's methods extended well beyond his immediate network. By maintaining stability and predictability in his territory, he created conditions that allowed legitimate businesses to thrive alongside his illegal operations. Shop owners knew they could operate without fear of random violence or extortion beyond agreed-upon arrangements. Residents could plan their daily lives without worrying about sudden territorial conflicts disrupting their neighborhoods. This stability attracted investment and development that might otherwise have avoided the area, creating a positive feedback loop that benefited the entire community. When federal authorities finally succeeded in disrupting Johnson's operations in the early 1960s, they discovered something unprecedented, a criminal network so thoroughly integrated into its community's social and economic fabric that dismantling it created more problems than it solved. The vacuum left by Johnson's departure led to increased violence, as various groups attempted to fill the power void, demonstrating the stabilizing role his leadership had played even within an illegal context.